Hey everyone, welcome back to the Fine Tuned Show. And today I have with me Kishore Bhatia, co founder of LeapFrogger. And I've worked with him before as well, so this has been a long time coming. Welcome to the show, Kishore.
Thanks, Gautam. Thanks for having me on this podcast.
Amazing. Would you like to start with a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I think you already gave a bit of a starter with us having worked together. So there's this link between Web3 and the evolution of web. So the most recent part is actually more around decentralized technologies. Having discovered Bitcoin in one of my previous, early days. I think that was somewhere around 2013, and that led to, I think, the rabbit hole that finally kind of gave me the ability to jump into this thing whole time with Ethereum. So around 2016, I started looking deeper into smart contracts and Ethereum-based technologies, which basically, if you think about how web has evolved from like Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, again, it's not easy to just like bucket them in those versions and phases, but still that evolution is from all the way to PC era to internet just for research and niche technologies to actually making sure that that internet works for more and more people and becomes an economic force in itself. I think I saw that potential in Web3 as increasing that access for a larger set of people. And then over time, in the last 10 years, that thesis has kind of like panned out more and more clearly. And now AI just adds more and more abilities, more and more intelligence, and more access to it. The last 2 years, I've been experimenting a whole bunch, combining crypto and AI, and then focusing more and more in how do I use that for, or like how do I use the abundance of intelligence for my own purpose, right? Building, experimenting with different projects, and then basically building tools and frameworks. And this year, primarily a lot more agentic focus. I think through and through, that technology career has actually evolved more and more into really what can you build and how fast can you build. And now it's more, it's actually more efficient and effective with AI. So that's what we are doing. LeapFrogger.ai is actually more of a AI R&D lab. We founded that, me and my co-founder Rodolfo, we founded that last year, discovering a few of our social agents, economic agents experiments leading into paid work. And that led to the forming of LeapFrogger AI.
Nice. Amazing. So let's jump right into it. So my first, and this is not more like a question answer, but more like a discussion, but at least we have some, anchoring questions to drive a conversation forward. So the first one is like, you went from being CTO at Affinity, where we had our first interaction as well, and then building decentralized identity, and now helping founders integrate AI in their products, like you just mentioned. What drove the shift? What carried over from Web3 world that's useful in AI? Like this is the second part of the question is more, because the first part somehow you have answered in the introduction, but the second part, what's useful in AI that you're bringing from the Web3 learnings, that's would be very interesting.
I think it's a great entry point for some of the shifts I've been seeing even throughout the last 24 years. Right, you'd always be like at the cutting edge or like at the cusp of the turn that's about to happen. Fortunately, I've been lucky to see some of those changes in technology and society, economic value that we add with building new stuff. So I think the common things first, right? So between Web3 and AI, one thing I found is the ability for us to build for access, right? So whether it's access to, a larger layer for, say, a monetary policy or a monetary layer for the whole world, whether it's access to identity in the digital world, so human identity, at least that's how I thought of Affinity back then. And then the last piece would be access to data, right? So whether it's data for like an individual's personal needs or the data that the individual themselves own on the digital web, or the data that happens to stay in silos in institutions, organizations, and between boundaries. So that's like, to me, the 3-layer problem: monetary layer, identity layer, and identity layer also has a very convoluted set of things like reputation, credentials, trust. And then the third is basically the data layer. And data leads to a whole bunch of business value that is being unlocked. So I see that as a continuation from Web3 to AI. So a lot of the problems that we were struggling with in the Web3 space, if you keep the monetary layer aside, which is, I think, solved, are still unsolved. So you think about identity, you think about reputation, you think about trust of doing one-on-one or one-to-many or B2B type of businesses. And then you have the third layer, which is, a whole bunch of data. Everybody has, so to say, a whole lot of data lakes and a whole lot of data. Individuals are amassing a whole bunch of data for their personal needs. But how do you make use of a lot of that context or the insights or maybe even decision making or judgment or taste that resides in that data? So to me, those three are like really interesting problems.
Nice. So yeah, it's more like kind of it's a full circle in some sense, like with especially with like these agentic use cases coming up, like there are even more identities, verified identities needed. There is even more data being generated. So it's like another, let's say, order of magnitude larger things have become, right? Awesome. And to continue, like, and this kind of leads us to how this is being used, and like the application part of it, like what you are primarily focusing on is like you work with startup founders also as like a fractional CTO, helping them how to integrate AI in their products or workflows or business outcomes and so on. And what are the most common mistakes that you see in this journey, like the founders are making in terms of AI adoption or even thinking about AI adoption?
So I'll probably step back a bit as to even my own ways of thinking, how they have been reset basically over the last 2.5 years. I think the first one is think of any business, right? Any founder, whether coming in directly from tech or, from a pure business idea. There's a little bit of a leverage that everybody is focused on, and that leverage has always been human resources, like call it labor, whether it's mental, physical. The other leverage has always been capital, right? And then as people work on this leverage, sometimes they build, or sometimes they buy, or sometimes they partner for the next leverage, which is code or media. So to me, those three leverages, and I've seen, a lot of other prominent figures like talk about this leverage in society, right? So, and the more you build on these three leverages, right? Human, human intelligence, human labor, capital, and code or media. I think that was the capital economy that we have lived in for the past, I'd say, many decades. With AI, I think that leverage becomes a bit more, like it becomes interesting, let's say, because now you could basically produce that code, with a simple thought or just expressing your idea. So I feel like that's a major shift that takes time to interpret, to understand.
So if I understood that correctly, so the mistake that these founders are making, or at least like it's kind of like now happening, is they're still thinking in older terms, like they need to move at a particular pace, while the like the technology now allows to move at a much faster pace. So the
Yeah.
people who are planning in older ways are staying stuck, and people who have kind of like adopted this new way of thinking, failing fast, trying, they are moving ahead much faster. It kind of like connects to an analogy I was thinking, like hundreds of years ago when first cars were launched, some of the people were going with horse carts and the other was just adopting cars.
Yeah.
And then if you want to reach somewhere, these older people will be, or like the previous generation would be thinking of, okay, we'll reach there in 10 days, and these guys are reaching there in 2 days, and then they are just taking the opportunity to move faster and actually like moving ahead of the others, and instead of like the other people who are planning with horses. Is that the same thing happening now with AI?
To some extent, I think that continues to happen with us living in a technology world where a lot of things in the pioneering or the frontier edge are happening sooner than they used to be, right? So just imagine the last 10 years that we have seen between crypto, Bitcoin laying out a monetary layer for the whole world, right? A decentralized monetary system, a whole bunch of like identity layers that have now been created for both humans and agents. Like I could not have predicted in 2019 starting Affinity that at some point Affinity will be actually building the distinction, the ownership, the privacy, and the trust layer for human and agents, right? I only thought of humans as the first thing that that would need identity. We haven't even covered the 8 billion people who actually still need access to identity, and we now have suddenly billions and billions of agents that are like cramming in and saying like, hey, we need our own like system for agentic reputation. But I think to add to the point that you just made about the horse and the car thing, if the waves of these technologies are happening so fast, then there is no way naturally we can catch up. So the paradigm shift itself takes time to understand. And that is why I feel like the try, learn, expand is a much more easier way to think through that, for at least for the founders and the CEOs who are like the top, decision makers, the top, I'd say like bandwidth deciders, like where is my energy, where is my focus? Not only but my team's focus will go. But the moment you switch that to a team, you're like, well, I haven't really seen a very good metric of how much productivity I have gained from doing this as an organization. So I think that's the dilemma that is needed to be worked through.
Right. And I can confirm that, like, what I've read in the last few days, like the actual productivity gains for organizations and teams are much, much lower than if you compare them to individuals or solo founders per se. And then the other thing is also like, I think there is a lot of this competition and FOMO going on. Like, if the other person is using AI, I should be using as well. And then instead of like thinking, okay, how does it help me? How does it help my organization? People are coming with the understanding or with the ambition that leave alone helping me or my organization. First, I need to figure out how should I get started with it. And that, like that part of not finding a problem and directly jumping into building an AI story is also making this kind of like, this weird shift where like AI is not giving the right productivity gains because you don't have the right thing to apply it to, or you have not thought through that part.
Yeah. So I think you're hitting on a very, very important aspect of AI, which is agency. I think across the human civilization, and I have a great interest in history, both like the history from a civilization standpoint, but also the history from a tech and evolution standpoint. And what I've realized is that the more you get tech advanced, and you can see this across the West and East, the economies that are advanced in using tech, right, they have higher agency. And not only that they have higher agency, I think agency is a very personal thing. Like every human being in this world have agency, but they have a higher harness to, to tools and to technologies to translate that agency, to translate that energy into outcomes. And to me, I think what has happened is AI has given you the feel that I have agency, I can do more things. But to be able to translate that agency into an outcome, right? That is either a business outcome or a personal outcome or a societal outcome. I think that hasn't yet happened. I think we still have to see that outcome of like, okay, we all have agency now, individual agency, as you said, right? And we can use technology and we can basically reduce the bandwidth, the capital, and I think the number of ideas it takes to get to something. But how do we measure, whether we have actually switched to a high outcome, a high productivity society? Yeah.
Right. So let's switch gears a little bit and then go into a little bit more of a product related, like mindset. Like, you were building products at VCG, then Affinity, then Block Apps, and you have been CTO for a bunch of these, like ventures. So, and now you are working directly with CTOs. My question is more related to that. Like, how do you see the role of a CTO changing because of this AI wave?
It's a very, very interesting question. I think part of the underlying change is already how work happens now, right? With an AI. I'd say like with an AI enabled or AI augmented agency, to some extent, the roles are also more malleable than before, right? The roles are also shifting. I don't know if you've seen that meme, the Spider-Man meme of like a product, an engineer and a designer all like pointing guns at each other. So it seems like the designer thinks that I can do product and engineering. The product guy thinks that I can do design and engineering. And the engineer thinks, yeah, because I can write code, I can do anything, right? So there's this whole aspect of the roles shifting. What I'm also seeing is that there was a time, so I can reflect this on my own experience as a CTO. There were a lot of times in like scaling a venture, like after early product market fit, where I had to decide what constraints do I put on myself and my team to ensure that I'm not releasing ideas fast enough, or like, I wouldn't say fast enough, but chaotically enough in my pipeline that they actually distract us from going to production or from actually getting things done, right? So think of like the times when you had to put constraints or like maybe break your actual speed into make sure that we can go to production, make sure that things don't break in production, right? Make sure that you have vetted certain things from product, business, viability, desirability. And I think that constraint led, engineering from a CTO's mindset is now probably you have more help as a CTO to not have to constrain yourself in trying new ideas, basically. So previously, a CTO was a good combination of an R&D guy and R&D person and a person who actually understands what does it take to really build this thing for the whole world, right? So there's like an engineering muscle, right? Reliability, scalability, thinking about what does it take to mature this idea into a deployed system, including systems engineering. And then there's this other aspect, which is trying things fast enough and always keeping an eye at what's coming next. To me, I think that taste that CTOs would have developed over time, that taste is now becoming really the differentiator. What is judgment? What is your taste, right? How do you curate what to build and what to not build? You can build anything. So then how do you decide? What do you really want to focus your tokens on, your energy on, right?
So in some sense, this made their job harder than before, because before they were like more moving in a straightforward direction, and now there are more because there is velocity available now, so there are more like decisions to make, more distractions to avoid, and the attention span has to like work for them in sense of like, okay, should I do this because I can do both, but is it even needed? So has it made their job tougher now in some sense?
I wouldn't say it has made it any tougher than it already is, for most decision makers, most founders, most CTOs. I think what has happened is that the variables that you work with have actually evolved. And you could call them different variables. So there could be like a learning curve and it's tougher. I'll give you an example, right? Previously, you could make a decision and you could stick with it for 2 to 5 years. And you would know that that decision was fine and I'm stable with it, right? Today, I think those types of decisions will need challenging yourself, will need like looking back, and will probably need a lot of reflection and rethinking, like literally every 6 months and maybe even lesser, right?
Yes, definitely makes sense. Now, coming back to the final question that I have, if a startup founder came to you today, which of course they come every day to you, with a product idea and said, I want AI in this, what's the first question that you would ask?
Effectively, you always start with why, right? Like you want to understand where they are coming from, right? And why would they want, AI in this specifically? At least, from the last 2.5 years of like working with or advising with some of the founders, some of the growth stage companies, and now also working with, a lot of them in like transitioning them into the world of AI. What I found is that the easy or the most obvious answer that most people would start with is, I want efficiency. I want that. I want everybody, I want what's happening in the world, which is everybody's basically releasing code faster. Everybody is doing QA faster. Everybody's able to cut their SDLC pipeline, the lead time to launch to production faster. And I would actually say, you know what, faster is not necessarily always good. So you might want to think about the same loop of try, learn, expand. And that's where AI can actually help you a lot, right? But then I'll give them a bit of a caution as well. So, to make sure that they are cautiously optimistic and not just necessarily overly optimistic about every change that they bring in.
Awesome. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's a pretty, let's say, spectrum oriented landscape right now. There is no binary here, like, whether you should be using AI or whether it makes you faster. Is that a good thing or not? It's like, it depends. The answer is it depends, right? So
yeah. And I think very similar to how we saw with crypto, right? Like, or any new technology, at some point, the technology has taken enough attention from the society, from the investors, from the users, from your communities and ecosystems that you start thinking about, oh, I have to put that word in my product, in my deck, in my offerings. And I feel like if you do that, if you're coming at it from a FOMO, it's fine that you have that FOMO coming in, but it's also important that you've given it a lot of thought by trying it yourself first. So that's something I've seen the founders, the CEOs who have tried things by themselves. I think Toby Lutke was the guy, if you remember, the Shopify guy, way back, I think a year and a half ago, when he was basically trying new things with these models. He realized that the whole way the work is done itself is shifting. So he started doing that. He started writing his experiences and he started like putting it back to his teams. To me, I think that's a model where even if you're trying something top down, you're trying it with leading with your experience, leading with your observations, and you're basically very careful in saying, where do I see the most value and where do I see that we still have a lot more learning and ways to go.
Okay, awesome. I think that's very insightful. Thank you for coming on the show. and sharing your insights. And at the end, would you like to give a CTA or like more information about LeapFrogger that you want the listeners to take a look at?
I would actually invite the audience, the listeners, the community to just ask us anything, right? Things can start from exchanging ideas too. We don't have to necessarily provide you a fully baked answer, but if we can, would be awesome. What we are learning right now is through that interaction, through that Q&A, and then we're very curious about use cases. We're very curious about what can we build next, and different ideas that are happening. So my CTA would be that, hey, ask us anything.
Awesome. We'll definitely leave the links in the description for people to take a look.
Yeah. Thanks, Gautam. This was amazing. Yeah, great questions.
Thank you for coming, Kishore. Have a good one.